I thought you meant if they stopped the video too soon and they came away thinking that all gypsies, Roma and travellers are nomads, and that is another danger of starting there. So that's obviously not true.
On which note, we will begin. So thank you very much indeed to all of you for joining us. A very, very warm welcome to everyone that's watching in the Zoom call as well. This is Progress and Dialogue's final conversation for change for the month. We're continuing obviously with our theme for Gypsy Roma Traveller History Month 2020. Our topic being what is in a word, languages of the travelling people. A very exciting and interesting topic, as I'm sure you've heard a little bit about just there. Which we will no doubt cover in great depth over the next hour and a half. Just as a reminder, we will be recording this session, so you can catch it later on YouTube as well. If anything, I suppose no swearing as well as probably or whatever, or indeed, I don't know, maybe you want to express yourself, it's up to you. Additionally, please feel free, if you are watching this as well, if you're just watching the six of us sitting here having a chat, please feel free to utilise our question and answer function. At the bottom of the screen, myself or somebody else will get your question and we'll be able to put it to our panelists throughout the conversation. First, however, please just allow me to introduce our panel for this evening. So I'll quickly start with Damien. Damien Labar is an English Romani Gypsy. English Romani Gypsy. He's an activist, writer, and journalist from West Sussex in England. Best known for his book *The Stopping Places: A Journey Through Gypsy Britain*. He's a theology graduate of St John's College, Oxford, and a former editor of the Traveller's Times. Damien has worked tirelessly for a number of years in promoting his culture and the Roma language, most notably through his filmmaking, spoken word, and poetry. Damien, welcome. We've got Owen de Barden, a member of the travelling community. He has previously been vice chair of the Irish Traveller Movement and is currently a core member of the National LGBT+ Traveller and Roma Action Group, as well as the manager of an adult education centre in South Dublin. He's worked in the house of the, you'll have to forgive me, how do you pronounce it?
Oireachtas.
Oireachtas, there we go, fantastic. With Senator Colette Clare, with a distinct focus on traveller policy, notably in the development of traveller culture and history and in the education bill. Owen is a strong advocate for the celebration and the use of the Gammon language, as well as being an avid keeper of traditions, lore and retellings. Owen, welcome to you as well. Tyler Hatwell is a showman living and working in London. He is a psychotherapist working primarily with adolescents. His undergraduate degree was in linguistics, where he undertook a study of the speech variety of showmen. In the GRT world, Tyler is the vice chair of ACERT, the Education Liaison Officer for the London section of the Showman's Guild. And in 2019, he helped to found Traveller Pride, the UK's network for LGBT+ travellers, which he continues to run. Tyler, welcome to you as well. Rahela Kirpachi is a Roma woman living and working in Glasgow. She's a project co-coordinator at the charity Romana Love. Much of her work is challenging discrimination and promoting equality for the Roma people here in Scotland. She's originally from Romania, but she grew up in Ireland from when she was 2 years old. She speaks Calderash Romanes and Jimbas, spending some of her time teaching Romanis online. She said, "It's always been my dream to teach Romanis, as it's not a language that you can learn in school or indeed anywhere else." And finally, last but not least, we have David Donaldson. David Donaldson is a Scottish traveller originally from Perthshire in Scotland. He's a recent graduate, I believe, indeed, of the University of Aberdeen. Davy spends much of his time studying intangible and material cultures. He's also a well-known social justice campaigner and advocate of dialogue between communities, and also the founder of our organisation, Progress and Dialogue. David believes that traveller languages need more recognition and protection as minority, and in some cases, Indigenous languages are at risk. So a very, very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you indeed for joining us this evening. Before we begin with our kind of conversations, I'll allow you to maybe say a bit more about yourselves. You've got up to 10 minutes just to kind of speak about yourselves, about your work, and why you feel that the language of indeed your particular travelling peoples is important. So if we start with Rahela, and you've got 10 minutes, on you go.
Yep, so hello everyone. I'm Rahela and I'm 22 years old. I'm from Romania, but I was born in Belgium and I grew up in Ireland since I was 2 years old, as Jacob said. I am a Roma woman and I currently work for Romano Lav, and I'm co-coordinating there. I'm also teaching Romanesque online privately, and also teached at my previous job, Swap Market, which it was kind of like a skill share, and everyone could, just join in without, they could share a skill themselves, so they could teach some French and they could learn some Romanesque from me. So it was an amazing thing to do and got so many people involved every week. So I'm still teaching online every week as well, and got loads of people there learning. And it was always my passion to teach, and I'm hoping to teach new generations and my daughter as well, so she can teach her children and her grandchildren, as I don't want this language to die. That's all from me from now.
Brilliant. Thank you indeed for that, Rahila. We'll move to Tyler then, if that's all right. Tyler?
Hi. Yeah, so as was explained, I'm a showman, but I wonder if it might be worth explaining what that is, because it's not something that everybody knows. It's not something that's often talked about in the kind of traveller circles. I use traveller because I don't like GRT. I think it's a bit ugly, particularly because as I said, I founded Traveller Pride, and LGBT GRT is hideous. But so we're the people that put on fun fairs more broadly, and there's sort of another lot that put on circuses, and it's very similar. So it's a culture that kind of has existed in one way or another it depends on, it's very hard to say when did fairs start, because sort of when did it stop being a market, and when did it start being about the kind of entertainments and the sideshows, and when did a cohesive culture form, which is kind of a bit impossible to say with the sort of records we've got. But if you look at kind of when there was a large migration of Roma to the UK in like the 17th century, that was kind of also the birth of the fair. And so when I studied my dissertation, I did a quite poor job of interviewing people and sort of documenting the speech variety of showmen. And it's just kind of a way of telling you about the interactions with other communities. So there's a whole lot of Romany in there, like sort of Anglo-Romany. There's also a whole lot of cant, but not the cant that Davey or Owen are going to talk about, although a tiny amount of that, but more cant as in so cant is a linguistic term that kind of, it's like a secret language or an anti-language or a cryptolect, and they're just, it's kind of a lexical reservoir that you use to like avoid the police knowing what you're talking about, or that just grows in underground communities quite often. That's what a cant is. And there's this thing called thieves' cant from that period, and like that comes in, and so it sort of shows you those markets and what that birth was. And so that was kind of the outcome of the dissertation, was just using the language or the dialect or whatever you want to call it to work out about the historical representations and the historical relationships between peoples and areas and that sort of thing that could be gone into in much more depth. Because what's interesting to me, and it's something that kind of narks me a bit, is that although there has been a lot of rubbish written about other travelling groups, if you look at any of the lots of sort of sociologists or anthropologists from 100 years ago, it was pretty diabolical. But there was something written about the people. But when you look at the books about showmen, it's much more lots about how rides work, and it's all about the front-facing stuff. But it's very rare to get anything at all about, it says Mr. Nichols is Walser, but who's Mr. Nichols and what was his life like? And that never kind of comes up. So in the same way that they worked out that the Roma had roots to India by analysing the language, that my thought was, well, if you look enough at the language, it's kind of a useful tool. I think tonight I'm going to be a bit of the unpopular panellist, who sort of, because my view isn't that languages are sacred and ought to be protected, it's that they're a tool that people use at certain times, and of course they change, and that if they stay static, that's not what a language is for. And I don't know. So that's kind of, I'm sure a lot of you won't like the things I have to say, but I'll try and be nice about it.
Don't bet on it.
Thank you for that, Tyler. Yeah, we'll move to Damien then, if that's all right.
I am a writer. I used to call myself an activist, but I don't anymore for various reasons. One of them is that I think that writers have to be free to say whatever they like, and I think activism, for better or for worse, often demands that you toe certain political lines. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but for me it can be difficult when you're writing creatively. So I deeply respect the word activist, but I use it with caution and not about myself. I think it's a very honourable term. I come from a mixed English, Romani, and non-Gypsy background, with some Irish travelling ancestry as well. So some people would say I'm half a traveller. Some would say I'm a gorger-bred bastard. There's various terms, polite and less polite, for somebody like me on both sides of the fence, really. But I found that very difficult growing up because I grew up almost exclusively with my Romani family. So I felt like a Romani gypsy, but I wasn't allowed to call myself one because we're very funny about heritage. There's almost a sort of an attitude of pedigree when it comes to that in Romani culture. So and I'm still very reluctant to call myself a Romani gypsy, although I do get called that sometimes in the press. That's a long but I think necessary sort of preface because it explains a lot about what I'm going to say and why I'm going to say it. I think I write more or less full time now. My last book was a book called The Stopping Places, which was really about the geography of Romani travellers and other ethnic travellers on the British mainland for the most part. And there's a little bit about the Isle of Skye on there. And I arguably it was too much to even try and go around Britain, to be honest. I mean, it was too much to even do parts of England from my perspective. But I certainly thought that trying to go to a lot of places in Ireland that are significant to travellers there would be a bridge too far. So I chose not to do that. And interestingly, I mean, language is a big part of this book. I think it's more about a sort of personal quest and about the geography and the history of Romani people in Britain. But language often ends up being the most controversial thing about something connected to gypsies and travellers, even if it's not the biggest thing going on there. So it certainly was basically there is some Romani language in my book, and then I had this sort of battle going on within myself and then simultaneously with other people about how to translate that, whether to translate it, whether to incorporate a glossary. And this is something that I've spoken to Davey about before, and I'm sure we'll revisit this. There's a lot of tension between the desire to use and honour and keep our languages and the views that certain people have on making them available to other people. And this varies widely from person to person, from family to family, and from, if you like, I mean, I hate these academic phrases, but I suppose I have to use them, from gypsy and traveller subgroup, from one to the next. We'd say something like that lot of travellers or that lot of gypsy people, but you use these academic phrases. So there's very little agreement about this. Romani people in Germany, for instance, tend to be very against non-Roma learning their language for historical reasons. I mean, Nazis learned their language in order to infiltrate and then murder them. So that's historically understandable. There are other groups of Roma people who aren't too worried about it. I come from a background which is quite cagey, I suppose, about most people are quite cagey about using the language in a way that communicates what it means to other people. I haven't spoken for 10 minutes yet, have I? I've nearly finished. I've got mixed feelings about this that I was hoping we'd discuss. I know there are people watching and listening to this, but I don't get many chances to talk about this with other gypsies and travellers. So from a selfish perspective, this is also nice for me to hear what you guys have got to say about it. But there was nothing in my book that hadn't been written in many, many books before. The only thing different was my opinion on linguistic matters, but all the words in there, all the sentences in there have been written down in some cases for hundreds of years, often by other gypsy people and often not. But there remains this idea that you're giving something away, that you're giving away something precious. And I find that very interesting because, and again, I've spoken to Davey about this in the past, that's not a way that all languages are spoken about. Only certain languages are spoken about in that way. When I was learning French and German at school, or Greek and Hebrew at university, nowhere did I encounter the idea that these were precious things that I had no right to be learning about. So it interests me that certain languages acquire that reputation. And Tyler used the lovely word cryptolects, hidden speeches, or secret languages. And for better or for worse, the Romani language in England certainly has often been seen in that way. How did I use it growing up? Probably the way that most English gypsies use it, which is at one end of the scale, dropping a Romani word into an English sentence, like, how you doing, mush? Or, that was cushy, wasn't it? And at the other end of the scale, the odd complete sentence, Dawdy chavvy, Rymush felling up the Toba Akai. And then various things in between. The way in which we didn't use it was as a fully inflected, grammatically inflected language of Indian origin, which is what Romanes or Romani Chib is to most Romani speakers in the world. It's clearly a language of Indian origin because its Indian grammar is intact. And most of the grammar in my dialect has been replaced with English. So it's a bit like Yiddish in that way, which has a Germanic structure and then some Hebrew in it. Yeah, that's enough from me.
So it's in 9 minutes 57 there. No, cheers for that, Davian. Thank you. We'll move on to Owen, if that's all right.
It's okay. I suppose, following on from what the introduction that was given, I'm originally from Clonartu, which is just outside of Tuam in Galway. Has a population of just around 4,000 people, and over 2,000 of those people are travellers. There's a concentration of travellers in the country. So growing up within the formation of the language use of it, it was quite fluid and quite open. And it also comes in a slightly different history than many other kind of countries and aspects find, is that the Irish language itself within Ireland was repressed for many years and hidden. And within the Irish structure, in Gaelic, there's 4 distinct dialects. So having kind of Gammon as part of our lives wasn't something that was very unusual, that we knew that different areas, different geographical spaces and different people would speak the same language a different way. And it wasn't until I would say I was around 9 that I started to realize that there was words that we would use that people outside of our immediate circle wouldn't use or understand. And which is quite a different experience, I think, from people who have lived in smaller communities, is how that language may be preserved and protected in different ways. I would be of the belief that we need to be sensitive, we need to continue the discussion. Languages need to be shared. That's how they survive, and that's how they prosper, and that's how they grow. Similar to Dimian, I would be a writer, and I released was soon to be out book on traditional folktales called Why the Moon Travels, in which there is the titles are in Gammon, there's words within Gammon, because it was followed on from oral playings of the stories that were transcribed. And it is a little bit known for sensitivities, but they were transcribed. So it felt very unnatural to remove a very natural part of a conversation, discussion, and concede it. But at the same time, we put in measures in place to make sure that the spellings of the words of ones that were used previously somewhere else. So in order to, I suppose, to give a sense of respect to people who have that sensitivity around it not being shared. But at the end of the day, I do think that our voices are our voices, and no one should silence us. I don't think there's a very complex history there. There's effects around oppression, around secrecy, around protection. But at the end of the day, if we don't actually allow the language to prosper, we ourselves are killing it. That's something I feel very, very strongly about. I also adore within the common narrative here in Ireland, where many of our words are co-adopted by the general population, but with total ignorance of what they actually mean. And sometimes that can bring up a lot of sensitivity within myself. Usually it's pride, unless it's demoted as slang. But yeah, and I think the language themselves, even the idea of secrecy. I have 11 dictionaries of Gammon and Cant. It's not secret. It's that someone hasn't put the effort in to do any sort of research. And even around identity, as being a gay man myself, I found the language give me a lifeboat in a certain time of my life when I discovered the language of Polari, which was the underground language within the LGBT community in England. And many of those words had Gammon and Cant in them, which was, from a very younger self, as I go, that was verification. I go, oh, yeah, listen, there's been interaction. There's clearly been LGBT travellers in the past. Otherwise, we wouldn't have half of this dialogue. So it's a part very much of who I am, of how I live my life, how I conceptualize ideas and movement through them. But and I'd love if we could find the pathway and the strength and the bravery to step beyond it being something that we hold onto fearfully, and to move it to something that we are delighted to share with the world and also our children to come. I'm going to pass it over now.
Owen, thank you so much for that. It's absolutely brilliant. And we'll finally move on to Mr. Donaldson. David Donaldson, please.
Yeah, I mean, much of what I was wanting to say has already been said by the other speakers. But all that I would add to it, as coming from a Scottish traveller perspective, I must actually caveat this initially. I wasn't meant to be on this panel discussion. It was actually going to be another Scottish traveller woman who's done quite a lot of work on our language. So I'm kind of off the cuff here, so forgive me. But what I will do is I will link to some of her work in the chat, and please go and have a look at it, our audience members that is, and panellists as well. But yeah, so coming from a Scottish traveller perspective, our languages, I should say, when I was growing up, were always treated with secrecy. It was always treated that you should try and keep them to yourself and not tell settled people or country folk, as we would say. We have two languages. We've got the Cant, which is the most common language that young travellers in Scotland will speak. And then you've got Búrla as well, which is a much older language, we think. It's not spoken as much amongst younger travellers. The younger travellers who use it tend to be from the West Coast and from the Highlands, so Highland travellers. But it's mainly spoken by the older people in our community. And we think that there's around 2,000 speakers of Búrla left. So it's a minority language even within our own community. In saying that, a lot of words in the Cant have origins in Búrla. We can't say, exactly where either of the languages came from. There's a number of theories. One that I'm particularly keen on myself is that Búrla was the indigenous language of Scottish tinklers, Scottish travellers, and the Celtic travellers that pre-existed the Roma migration. Then when the Roma migrated across to Scotland in the 1400s and the 1500s, we started to see obviously intermarriage, and the Cant might have came about at that point. And the reason I say that is because a lot of words in Cant as well are Romany. A vast majority of them are Romany or Romany in origin. But there's also a lot of Old English in there that would have been used as market languages, market words by the settled community around that time that have also made their way into Cant. But yeah, I mean, certainly the languages, they're not in any way dead. It's something I've heard, and it's something that really gets to me. They are, I would say, different in terms of how young travellers engage with them in contrast to how the older people in the community engage with them. And there's different words that are used, but every language changes, right? Every language over years takes on words, loses words. It's just what happens. But there is a degree of which academics, especially in the folk revival, kind of clung to the older versions of Cant, the older versions of Búrla as the the real or the true languages, and anyone that didn't speak those languages were deemed to be less traveller than other people. So there's a lot of really difficult legacies with our language as well that young travellers kind of have to navigate growing up. And I'll share, before I stop, I'll share one wee story. I remember I was on a camp when I was younger, and speaking to my granda about cant and cant use. And what we've got to realise is that the cant is a guarded language, not because we don't like telling people about our culture, but because it kept us alive for so long. And in a lot of cases, we had to warn people in our community because we were vastly discriminated against, and it kept people from dying. And that was reiterated to me by a story. I'll try and find a recording of it somewhere and link the audience to it. But it was basically about burkers. There was people in Scotland who were body snatchers, basically, and they would take people and they would kill them and they would sell their bodies. Hellish thing. But there was a wee laddie who was going to fall victim to these body snatchers. There was another little boy who knew it was going to happen, and he thought, how can I possibly warn this traveller laddie that this is happening? So he spoke to him in cant, and he said, "The cow the hash she gobbles, the cow the hash she has, shan kibble shan potty bing every and fikawa. Ha the hantels haben, ha the hantels ha, fiken edis te a naggin, then a sloch a hantels slap." And the wee laddie got away. And my granda sat to me and he said, do you know what he said? I said, well, of course I do. And I told him what it meant in English, and it's basically a warning, right? They poisoned his tea. So the wee boy was saying, don't drink the tea, but eat all the people's food and you'll be okay, and get away. And he said, right. He said, so if you go telling country folk our language, they would know what he's saying too, and it wouldn't work as a warning, and you'd be dead. And that's how he got across to me this kind of really difficult way of I suppose telling me the language was really important, and it was more part of our identity rather than just a spoken language. And it's something I think that all travellers grow up with, is this kind of internal battle as to whether treat it as part of your identity or treat it as just a language like we would with English, or whether we can actually mould the two together and treat it as our identity, but it's also just a language. And I think there's a lot of conflict in there, there's a lot of controversy, but that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Grand. Thank you to all of you for all of that. That's absolutely fantastic. We'll move on to some questions then that we've kind of formulated a bit to kind of try and kick off some conversation. I mean, to begin with, how important, I mean, obviously it goes without saying, but what is the importance of your language, do you think, to your identity? And you also, David there and a couple of others also spoke about, the importance of secrecy in keeping communities safe. Is that still something that you would say is important today, or is it, has it moved on slightly since? Anybody can come in. Anybody can come in. There you go. So kick the conversation off.
Well, go on, Damien.
No, go on.
Okay, I was going to say that the answer would be like going, how long is a piece of string? It's all situational. Is it something that protects us or something that promotes us? Is it something that's tied to our identity? Is it something that's a defense? It all depends on how we use it. Like one way or the other, it is a tool, but it's one that comes with such significant historical connections. Like one of my favorite words in Gammon is the word Olami, which means the dark of the night. That word actually is survived from Om, which was the script of the Druids, to show that we were part of that lineage, and doesn't actually survive in modern or older Irish, but it was one of the things that we were able to preserve. And I think that changing cat form is very reminiscent of the struggles and the changes that are going on historically and currently within our communities. But I think it would be, and this is very personal, it would be a loss to myself to not share something so beautiful because there's a historical harm in the past towards us. It almost, it would continue that harm in such a historical degree, and not to demote the current crisis that we're in either, but the idea of the kind of going, like, if it's something that's going to be fluid for the rest of our lives, I don't see it ever coming to a single conclusion. But that part of that discussion and evolution is in itself seems to be part of the traveling nature. It is in itself a journey, and it's one I don't think will have a very single conclusion, but I look forward to understanding the varied opinions and passions, but as long as people use it and celebrate it and share it, I would be more than delighted. There you go, James. I'm handing over to them, or whoever, really, Davey, anybody else?
It's incredibly important to me. It's difficult to describe really how important the language is to me. I think there's a whole worldview contained within it. I think that's true of every language in the world. Interestingly, the diversity of languages in any geographical area is in direct proportion to the diversity of plant life. So if you go to Papua New Guinea, which has incredible biodiversity of plants, you have one of the highest concentrations of different languages in the entire world. The same is true in parts of the Amazon rainforest. And I think that tells us a lot about language somehow. I'm not sure exactly what it tells us, but I think there's something very profound in there. And in the same way, you know, one of the problems with translation, as anyone who's tried to do it will know, is that it's impossible. And when I look of say my other language, I grew up speaking English and English Romani, of my other language, English Romani, is there's this tendency to translate words in this way that a grammarian wants to do, because the first thing they'll do is they'll look for the word to do or to make, so that'd be cur in our language, but that's not really what it means. It's a multi-purpose word that means lots of different things, and some of its main meanings are things that I can't say in this conversation, but I'd never seen that before, because people were trying to take one language and fit it into another, you know, like layering an overhead projector or something, and it doesn't work like that. I lived in London for a few years, and it's only when I left that I realised when I was living there, I barely ever spoke my language. And that's because my family were from the countryside, and they worked the farms, and, you know, they caught wild animals, and they knew how to get wild herbs and make remedies and things like that. And then I came back to where I grew up, and suddenly the language was living in me again, and I started to use it again. And then I felt a bit sad. I thought, well, does that mean that my language is no good in the modern world? If I can't use it in the city, I can't describe the things around me, but I can walk down a country lane and I can describe everything I see in detail. But that doesn't determine the value of a language. You know, it doesn't have to be on the instruction leaflet for a kettle you buy from Argos in order to be worth something. Because one of the first questions I find people often ask if they find out you speak a different language is, oh, can you say this? You know, and they'll give you an example, and it's like, no, I couldn't sell someone insurance in the Romani language, or maybe I could. You know, I'd have a go if I was hard up, but I think I'd struggle. But I can use it to write poetry about the moon and the sun and the stars and catching the rabbit and you know, and things that meant a lot to my family who taught me this language. So there's some of the emotional reasons why I think it's so important. I think it's also particularly important to me because coming from a mixed background and looking, as I've been told countless times in my life, not like a gypsy, as most people imagine they look. It was something that I could use externally that proved who I was. I think it was extra important to me. I did notice that a lot of my family members didn't seem to care about it as much as I did. Mm-hmm. You know, and maybe that's because they just seemed or looked like typical Romani gypsies. So I was a bit combative and loved it for that reason as well. There was a second part to the question which I've forgotten about. There's something about where the language is going, I think.
Indeed.
Anyway, we can move on. I've spoke for ages.
Tyler, Rahila, have you got anything to?
I could say something. Yeah, so, like we've touched on like the secrecy thing, and what Damien was saying there about, you know, being able to use modern words, because it is a bit strange that, I mean, all languages are weird now in this world where information is shared instantly. You know, it isn't regional anymore, or it isn't sort of culture dependent. The word for internet in every language is internet. you know. And so it's the idea of it belonging to just one group now is always not going to make sense, because you aren't only connected to the group that you're from anymore, you know. So as a little kid, I grew up hearing sort of, like ancient cant words, and then also brand new American slang because I had a telly, you know. And there's this idea of that I mean, it's already been touched on, this kind of nonsense idea of this kind of like mirage of a perfect gypsy, or the perfect, like, and he speaks all the words and he wears all the clothes and he cooks Joey Gray just perfect, and all this kind of rubbish, as if like there's ever, then what was his dad like? Was he twice as traditional, you know? And so where's it all come from? And so I think I take it a bit less seriously, this kind of the dialects and the languages. In fact, I know some people get really upset about the idea of them being called a dialect. But linguistically, there's no difference between a language and a dialect. There's not a real difference.
There's an old Yiddish saying, a Sprach is a dialect mit Flot und Army. A language is a dialect with an army and navy.
Yeah.
Just came to mind.
Yeah, and that's the point. It's just sort of, a language is who says it's a language and who has the power to say it. And like, because there's as much variation in some of the dialects of in the British Isles as there are between two languages, you know. So I would always say that I always say the variety of speech, you know, showman speech, because I think language is a bit lofty. But I mean, it's important to me for a lot of the reasons that have been said. And like, you know, the serious thing of, you know, Davy's story about, it saved somebody from being murdered, you know, like, true or not as that story is. By the way, I didn't prepare a song. I hadn't realised that we were all meant to. I feel like a right did. But like, it also, I mean, because people get narked about, we shouldn't call them secret languages, but they have also served like that, because back in the old days, we did, there wasn't so much intergroup communication, so it could do that in the same way that like Geordies could talk about me without me knowing, because I don't know the words in Geordie. And so on the fair, there's been plenty of times where we've had to, we've been talking and someone said, Gavin's here, shut up. You need the other, or you need to talk about that fella, or like, dick eye at him. And it has been useful for those purposes. And it's also useful, a bit like a kind of Masonic handshake of signalling in the room who's in the group, which, Owen mentioned Polari earlier, which I'll get onto it a little bit later, but I don't want to get into it too much. But that's what people say that was for. And, as a tiny little daft example, on a small village green, if you're taking the fair, everybody, there's only about 10, 15 families. But when I was a kid, we also used to open at Greenwich on the park, which is enormous on Blackheath Common. And so you just didn't know everybody there. But when you're a little kid, you're not minding any of the rides because you're too young, but you want to have a go on all of them. And your ones that know who you are will let you on for nothing. But the ones that don't know that you're a showman, you've got to say something to them in the dialect or something. Otherwise, how are they going to know that you're a showman? So, it's daft, but that's what it was for. And so I don't mind it changing. I don't mind that my little brother doesn't say the same things that I said when I was his age, but it's always going to retain something. It's always going to mean something, because it's not just the secret version either, because if it was only for the secret version, I wouldn't say any of the words in front of my dad. I'd just speak English because it's a bigger, more useful language. So, it's important to me. I don't hold it as sacred. I do think that it tells us a lot and is useful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'll just quickly direct a question to Rahila as well. This is one that we've had come in through the Q&A box, which everybody's more than welcome to put a question into, everyone watching if they so wish. Obviously, Rahila, you teach Romanese to people, obviously, who don't speak it. Some people might consider it, cultural appropriation, or indeed threatening for non-GRT people to be able to understand what GRT people are saying in there. What do you think about that, or what's your kind of take on
Well, I'm not really sure how to approach this, but like I think the Romanesque language is quite important to me as my identity. Since I'm Roma woman, I kind of feel like that when you're a Roma person, people kind of like expect you to already speak Roma. Like I know I have kind of some friends that are like Roma but don't actually speak the language, and you know everyone just expects that person to know Romanesque, and then you know saying that they're not like 100% Roma because they don't speak the Romanesque language, and that person is currently trying to learn Romanesque so they can feel like they're, you know, they fit in. So yeah, definitely they're like it's quite important for me, and as I'm teaching the language as well, I feel like it's a part of me, and it's something that I always wanted to do since I was a kid. And like I grew up in Ireland, and I kind of like I grew up kind of like around 8 years in Portlaoise, and then kind of like all around Ireland, like Galway, Dundalk, you know, kind of all around Ireland, and had very few Roma families there. So I kind of mostly learned Romanesque from my parents, and my father is Gilderash and my mom, she's Jimbash. So I kind of got a bit of a mixture of Romanesque there. But I tend to stick more with Gilderash because that's kind of the main like dialect that is spoken in the Roma community here, as well as in Romania and other parts. So even say like Slovakian Roma, I can kind of understand the basics of what they're saying and try and have a conversation with them. So I'm teaching currently Gilderash Romanesque, and there is like hundreds of different types of like dialects in Romania and in Europe as well. And it really like depends on the like say town you were in or where you grew up, that you know words do change, or you know, as I think, I don't remember if it was Owen who said that how do you say that, like you kind of take on words from where you're traveling to, or you know, if say I traveled from Romania to here, I started to like get introduce more like English words. Like right now I'm kind of speaking half English, half Romanesque. Like I'm not like when I have a conversation with my husband, I'm not fully speaking like Romanesque or fully English. I just kind of mix it all up together. I just I think I'm doing the same with my daughter. Like she can speak more English than Romanesque, is because we're always speaking English at home. Yeah.
Can I come in at this point as well?
Yeah.
And we've had another question as well from a police officer in the chat as well, and I think it ties in really closely to what I'm going to say, and you might want to come back on it as well, Rahela. But you know, I think when it comes to, I mean, our language it's not completely full. So like to teach someone Cant would be difficult, but it only really makes sense within certain contexts. It's very difficult to teach people certain contexts, right? So it's not as easy as saying, well, this word means this, because it might not mean that depending on the context of this conversation, or you know how you're using it or who's using it even. So it's quite complex. And to my knowledge, I've not seen anyone teaching Cant like what you do with Romanesque. But I think it's more to do with the complexity rather than the safeguardingness of it. But what I have seen here from this police officer is he's asking, kind of building on a project that was done in Slovenia, how would it be taken within the Roma community if you taught Romanesque to police officers, for example? Would there be any guardedness around that, or do you think it would be a good thing?
I think the Roma community wouldn't see it as a bad thing, because that way they could communicate with the police officers, and you know they would be able to like say their opinions, or you know if something happened they can speak up. Whereas you know if something happens now and they can't communicate with the police officers and they would need interpreters, so definitely I think it would be a really good thing for the community, and they wouldn't see it as, you know, they would have to like safeguard their language and keep it as a secret language.
Well, my take would be that they could just start employing Roma people.
Very well said, Tyler. Yeah.
There are 100 at least members of the Gypsy Roma Traveller Police Association, which they're not all actually from Britain and Ireland, but most are. Some are from continental Europe. So there are more Gypsy, Roma and Traveller police officers than I thought they were before I found that out. I mean, in theory, you shouldn't have an objection, should you, to the idea of the police learning a language that might be helpful. But in practice, the history of police interaction with, say, my community, English Gypsies, is bad. It goes back to before there was such a thing as a police force, the sort of the antecedents of the police, if you like. So private men-at-arms and their successors brutalising gypsies and travellers. And that tradition, unfortunately, has continued in the police force. And if you look at something like the Dale Farm eviction, which was mostly of Irish travellers living in Essex, in England, the police were meant to be there to keep the peace while professional bailiffs evicted those people, but actually they carried out the eviction themselves because they wanted to go and give the travellers a kicking. So in that context, I think you'd be looking at significant, different community emotions about that, which would probably be interpreted by some police officers and no doubt the media as, well, they don't want them learning it because they're all a load of crooks. Mm-hmm. I'm saying this, and I'm a member of the Society of Authors with an Oxford degree, so I'm not earning my money by crooked means. And I mean, they're weird means, but not in that way. And this is my opinion. So I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it's a really complicated idea. I'm not against it per se, and I've known Gypsy and Traveller police who speak these languages because they're their languages. So, but I think it's a tricky one, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to sort of try and meld a couple of questions here, which have sort of come in. One of them's come in, another one's we've already had written down. So, I mean, from the conversation that we've had already, we understand that there's perhaps issues in actually the recording of the different languages, and also there might, not necessarily be that many young people, or there's young people. It's not necessarily that they're not taking it up, but they are learning it in a different way, or they are using it in a different way. Do you think that this could lead to a kind of slow death of GR2 languages in general?
I don't think so. I think if you go back, there's words changed all the time. I mean, I'm kind of mixed myself, like Damien was mentioning with his own background, but my mum's people, a lot of them were Gypsy people or Romani people. So they spoke predominantly Anglo-Romani. So my great-granddad spoke that. But even, I look back on some of the notes that he wrote down, because he was writing a dictionary, right, which was unheard of back then amongst, my great-granddad, so he was, it was quite a while ago he was writing this. And it got broken up and he got robbed anyway, right? He got robbed, his place got burgled, and he lost all his notes, so he never completed his dictionary. But from the notes that I was looking at, a lot of the words in there weren't just Romani, right? There was a lot of words of gammon in there, there was a lot of words of cant. So clearly, even within his speech, and he spoke really old Anglo-Romani, some would say the original Anglo-Romani, but even within his speech, it wasn't all Romani. There was evidence that people had taken words, they'd left words, So I think it's the way with languages that we will always leave some words behind and take on new words and new meanings for words. And I don't think that necessarily means that the language is dying. What I do think is that young travellers, speaking from a traveller perspective here, have what I think could be called cultural trauma. I speak about, obviously my father knew a lot more cant than I did, his father knew a lot more cant than he did, and the issue was that, if you go back to even the 70s, lots of traveller bairns were getting taken off their families and put into care for no other reason than the fact that they were travellers. So, anything that kind of outwardly set you apart from settled people was people went into kind of not hiding, but they tried to hide anything which would automatically set you apart from settled people for safety. And one of them was the language. So, you know, my dad would obviously told when he was younger not to speak the language when he was at school. I was told when I was at school that if I didn't want bother at school, I wouldn't speak the language at school. And that happens a lot. And there's a lot of young travellers who consciously make the effort to hide the language and they don't use it to try and get on in life, even if that's to try and get a career, things like that. And what happens then is some of the words don't get passed on, not because we're ashamed of them, but because we're scared of what that will do to the younger people. So I think that what we do need to do is we need to get a bit more cultural confidence. And the way in which we get that is by decreasing the inequalities that Gypsy, Roma and traveller people actually face in this country. I think if we can decrease the marginalisation of our communities will feel safer to outwardly show their culture and to really be outwardly proud of who we are, because we are, within our communities, very, very proud of who we are. But I think that it acts as a barrier to passing that language on, you know, even subconsciously.
I agree, Davey, and I think one of the things that I suppose concerned me a lot when people talk about the one true language. If the language isn't losing and picking up new forms of speech and ways to interpret it, it is dying. You know, because there will be natural word loss, and over time people can say things less. So I see language evolving. The creation of a community of people who come together who share understandings and concepts and ideas. And I totally understand how it's connected a lot with the social status, especially here in Ireland, around accents. So I wouldn't have been interpreted, I suppose, people wouldn't see me as having the typical Trevor accent. But I'll give you an example of last year, we had a Trevor woman who was denied access to a public house, a pub. And she followed all the steps accordingly when you were refused access. She filmed, she was polite, she asked people, was it actually a private function or was it a public function? It turns out it was a public house, all the kind of things, went to court, which was covered by the Irish Times quite poorly, and the judge threw out the court case because the main factor is that her accent didn't make her sound like a traveller. And because she didn't sound like a traveller, she couldn't possibly have experienced discrimination as travellers experience, especially in relating to public spaces. So that was what that actually sent not only to herself, but that was an attempt at eroding her identity, but also sends a signal quite strongly into the community that you can only be a traveller, or the majority of the population only see you as a traveller if you tick these boxes. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people will hold on to certain understandings around language so strongly. Like something I see with some people in the older generations to say, that's wrong, that's not how you say it. And that brings a lot of anxiety to me, because you're not the authority. You may have the person of age, you may have more understanding, but none of us are the ones who say that we can't communicate to our own understanding that develop naturally to each other. So while it's a tool, it is also like it's a creation of our culture, and our culture has never been a stagnant, isolated one. So if we're not picking up new forms, ideas, and concepts, we're living in absolute isolation to our own detriment.
I think that the like we get a lot anyway. I think it happens to all of the groups that we're talking about, but sort of in particular, if you look at kind of like the Gypsy lawists, because they're just the ones that have done most of the writing, you get so much sort of external idea of what makes you, oh yeah, you're not doing traveller right because you don't speak it, or you're not doing traveller right because you don't dress like this way, or now there's all the thing of, you know, amount of nomadism, like, oh well, if you're only out for a little bit, like, and it's just some bureaucrat saying, oh, it's 6 weeks travelling makes you a traveller, you know, more than X amount of month, or, you know, and so the idea of it being an external set of guidelines is always bonkers, and it's always like, I used to work for a charity called London Gypsies and Travellers, and we'd sometimes get emails from like a lawyer or something saying, oh, this person claims that he was discriminated against by my client, would you be able to verify he's a true gypsy? And it's just, what does that mean? Like, I would lick him and see if he tastes like one, you know. But sort of in terms of going back to what that means for language and whether it's going to change, I mean, I do think there is a certain amount of what Davey was saying about the kind of it being shocked out of us when there was a lot more assimilation. There was a lot more like, oh, you know, we go to school, you know, the generations that started going to school more often will have had, you know, a big wave of like, well, who are these people? The easiest thing you can change, you can't change your appearance quick. So I believe that. I also think that less sinister is kind of what I was saying earlier about the tellies, and you know, every is that on his phone he can look at like people from every culture like constantly and be chatting to people in a way that I didn't have back when, you know, I didn't have a mobile phone until I was, I don't know, 14 or something. And so it will change because of the access that people have now. But we never have the question of Italians are losing Italian because they keep using American words. And we never say that about like places with a nation state. It's always any groups that don't have the authority, the army and the navy, are then like, oh, you know, you're losing it. But no one cares that, you know, Americans are using loan words from other countries, because that's what a language is. Like, English people don't speak Middle English because that would be, you know, it's not useful. It changes.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I do think that I've thought a bit about why none of our languages that we're discussing here have official recognition anywhere in Britain and Ireland. Do they? I mean, or am I wrong about that? That Romani is only recognised, I think, as an official minority language in 8 European countries, and none of them are the countries that have the really large Roma populations. So that's another interesting thing to think about. When you look at the reasons for that, I mean, I've puzzled for a long time over why all the languages of, say, Celtic origin in Britain and Ireland, except the traveller one, are recognised as minority languages, even when they ceased being spoken community language centuries. For instance, in the case of Cornish, which has had a great revival in recent decades. You end up coming up to the fact that it's the people who speak them. It's not how long they've been spoken here or whether anyone still does. It's the people who speak or used to speak them that is the problem. That's why Gypsy and traveller languages aren't officially recognised. In terms of barriers to there's a couple that we haven't mentioned. One that always interested me is that I think our own values can prevent language use sometimes. I'll give you an example. The other week, an old, not a relation of mine, but an old man that my family used to travel with come and visited my great-grandmother, and we were all sitting and talking. And I think he had a bit of a bee in his bonnet that I'd written this book, and he thought that meant that I thought I knew everything. Do you know what I mean? I don't think I know much at all, to be honest. I've just written a book. But he said, now I could tell you words. I could speak the Romani language in a syllable of words. What he meant was he can speak in complete sentences. And you know, I can as well. Not only that, but I've learned a bit of Calderash Romani language, the language of Rahela's father. But I couldn't say any of this because he's a 75-year-old man. I have to call him uncle, listen to what he says and say, yes, uncle, and nod my head. Even if he's insulting me and saying things that are completely inaccurate, I just go, yes, uncle, until he leaves. And I'll never have a conversation with him in the Romani language, because if he thought I was using more words than he knew and showing off, it'd cause a problem. So there are also some internal factors there, I think. You know, and coming back to the Calderash Romani language again, which it's been mentioned a few times, but for people who don't know, it's probably the most widely spoken form of the Romani language in the world. And it's been learned by quite a few English Gypsy people through the Pentecostal church, who've learned it so that they can speak to other Roma people from other countries. I've learned it so that I can speak to my friends and because I just wanted to learn it. And I wanted to know what it'd be like to speak a form of Romany that had a complete grammatical system, because mine doesn't. But I think that one thing that did happen in me when I first learnt about that form of the language was that I felt sad about my own language. Like mine was a sort of crap version, basically, like the version of a load of half-bred gypsies that can't speak their own language properly. And I think that's the way that our language has been treated by academics and by a lot of writers in the past. And that interests me as well, how you can internalize some of those feelings, you know, like your language isn't good enough. It's sort of the language of a sort of rubbish version of your people, in a way. It's only in recent years that I've got my head around that, and I can be fully proud of my dialect and speak it confidently without wishing that I spoke another Romany dialect, really. And this is in play all over the world, particularly with people who speak mixed languages like English Romany. They're everywhere. Everywhere there's contact between two languages, you get Creole languages all over the world. And often there's a kind of shame that you speak a non-standard language.
Mm-hmm. No, I have to agree with that. Go on.
No, I have a question for Hila, because she mentioned that you use it at home mixed. And I found that really interesting. And like, does that bring up the complications of feeling it's less, or is it just that you're using it as a part of your life? And I love that, because you're someone who teaches it, so it's obviously something that's really important to you. But in your life, it's mixed. So what's that say to you or bring to you?
Well, it's kind of difficult sometimes, because I feel like I'm arguing a lot with my husband when it comes to saying certain words, because like I do have a mix of Guldarash, Jimbash, and my husband speaks mostly Guldarash, and he grew up in a town right beside my town, so they both kind of have similar dialects, but there's still, like, I have more kind of older words than for example, the word zida, I use it a lot, which is like not to waste. And I always say to my little baby, like, don't waste that, tinakara zida. But my husband says risipa, and that's a more Romanian word. So he kind of grew up and has more Romanian words into his Romanes, and we always kind of correct each other, and he's like, no, risipa, and I'm like, no, it's not the correct Romanes term. So it's just kind of like a word that I picked up from my dad, and my mom used it as well, and grandparents and all that. So it's a word that is definitely older and was used by our elders, and I guess my husband didn't grow up with hearing that word, so whenever he hears it, he's just kind of like, no, you have to say it my way. But I just stick to what I know, and do want like the older words kind of to go on to generation to generation and not just kind of die. I do feel like some words are kind of dying, like people not wanting to say them, or just say the more Romanian words. Like I do hear a lot of Roma people now using more Romanian words, and even family members as well, they're starting to use Romanian words. So I do feel like a bit that is kind of dying, but not completely. So I'm trying my best to kind of keep it going, and everyone know that like it shouldn't die.
That's really important, Rahela, and I think you've kind of touched on something that I was wanting to bring up as well, kind of building on what you've said and what Damien said as well, is kind of the notion of a tradition bearer, right? It tends to be in our community someone who's older, and the way that, I think I'm right in saying this, but everyone on this call, the way all of our communities work is there's intense respect for the older generations in our community, so much so that, as Damien was saying, you don't correct them, you do nothing that would put you on the same level as them, or even perceive put you on the same level as them, because they are higher than you because they are older, so they're more respectful.
Yes.
But I think what that does is, for non-Gypsy, Roma and traveller peoples, I think they look at that as the older travellers or the older Roma or Gypsy people know more about the culture, they're the tradition bearers, and the younger people aren't interested. Right? I think that's how it's often perceived. Yeah. And it's something that, I've had it a heap of times. Like, people will come up to me, and up until recently I found myself almost trying to validate that I do know about my own culture and my history and traditions. And but more and more recently, I'm starting to recognise that it's not that younger people don't know as much, or that younger people don't know the folklore or the songs or the language even. It's that when we're in the company of older people, we won't talk about it, right? Because it's disrespectful. And I think people out with the communities look at that as our language is dying or our culture dying, but it's not, because when we're their age, we'll be able to say the same stuff because we do know it. It was even, I mean, a couple of days ago there, I was sitting with my granddad, and he was talking about old traveller songs, right? And I know loads of old traveller ballads, and I could have sat there, I could have sang them to him, right? But equally, I waited. I didn't sing him anything because it would be disrespectful, right? So I waited. He sang a bit of a ballad that I know really, really well, and he was like, I can't remember how the rest of it goes. I couldn't then come in and tell him the rest of the ballad, could I? Because it's so disrespectful. But anyone watching that kind of exchange would think, I don't know the ballads. I do. So I think it's something that has to be said about when people say our languages are dying, that there's almost a level of responsibility on us to not feel like we have to validate ourselves. But I think it's exactly what you're saying, Rahel. It's about how we pass it on to the younger people in our community, just through everyday life. It's not, you don't sit them down and say, oh, well, this is this word, this is that word, but it's really just getting passed on. I think that's where our strength lies as cultures.
And I know I'm realizing I'm talking a lot, so I will finally shut up. But
please talk as much as you want, please. You're more than
it's just something that came up about generational respect in our ancestors and kind of our elders. Like there's subtleties to that as well. For instance, within my own kind of family structures, like direct family members, there's that kind of like very much like respectful and taking in that information. However, people outside the direct family line, you can respectfully disagree. And as long as it's respectful, you can, because the idea would be we're not a monocultural form. To say, I understand that, but there's a difference. And sometimes that's received very, very well. Other times it's not received very well at all. An example would be last year, there was a Travel Pride event, and they wanted to have it in Gammon. So we don't have a word for pride. So the natural assumption is you're going to use a synonym, something similar. And there's a word called tashter, which kind of means strength or like vigor or like energy. And so we went with like Min Care Tashler. The fallout of that word alone, and the use of that word, I felt even today, and that happened in May of last year. So the consequences of this idea of it's the wrong words, the wrong interpretation, you're kind of going, here's the source material, here are the people who told me, here, ring my father, like, please, for the love of God, And but there's this sense of there is this sense of being respectful, but also there are people within the community who want to be the gatekeepers of it. And that can be out of anxiety, that can be out of the interpretation that the young people can't carry it. It can be out of, the idea would be, especially with myself, I wouldn't be seen as traditionalist. So people won't want, sometimes people won't give me things because they don't fit into the idea of a man with 17 children. Or this idea of going to go up in the morning. And it has all these kind of expectations on you. So that has a dynamic in place. But I do think that if we want to, if we want to be able to give fresh life and lungs to things, but respectful disagreement is something that we can cultivate within ourselves. And it's something that I always find, like even like my own family within it, and they speak the same language. Just say my aunt, my father, and my mother, the words for boy is subla, sublin, and sublik. They will never agree. They're all in their 60s. And it sounds like a very small variation, because a sub just means it means kind of cow, because in Irish, buchel just means cow minder, so the natural overcall. They will never agree to it. They will stop each other in the sentences. They will correct each other, and it's just a part of it. And I think that rather than see that as a challenge, we should see that as a point of diversity. That even within the small family, it's alive.
Mm-hmm. You used a really. Oh, sorry, go on.
Well, I mean, like it's not uncommon in any kind of minority group, especially ones that have focused, that have had a lot of discrimination, to kind of, you've got to cling to something. You've got to have, if you don't have any kind of state, and you don't have any land, you don't have any like regular protections, and you don't trust the institutions, things that, like a language that, to someone from another culture, their language isn't something they give two thoughts about. But because it's sort of one of the only things that you've got, it stands to reason there will be some people, and I've seen it, and we've all seen it, who do feel like, no, it's my thing, I've got to protect. when I did my dissertation, when I told Dad about it, the first thing he said is, "Are you going to give the game away?"
Yeah.
You know, like, and there is just this feeling of like, no, that's ours, and I get where it comes from. It comes from having not a lot else.
Mm-hmm. There was a phrase that Owen used before we started this call properly. There was a phrase that Owen used, which I've written down. It was custodians of information, never gatekeepers, which I rather liked. Do you think that in order to, protect just as best as possible, there needs to be a sort of attitude shift in the way that perhaps older members of communities are passing down this information, and the way that there is that kind of interaction amongst younger people and older people, and if you understand what I mean. I'm seeing a lot of faces staring back at me.
I mean, like, my kind of iconoclastic take is that it is a bit false to try and, like, why would we protect the language now rather than 10 years, like, as if this is the right version, you know, in the same. It's good to kind of document it to sort of see how it changes, but the idea that, like, oh, it needs to be protected, like, my view is that the stupidest organization in the entire world is l'Académie Française, which is this kind of big, it's this French organization that decides, you know, whenever there's a new concept, they decide, there's a committee of very, very old, dusty people who decide how it should work and which verb we should use and whether it's masculine or feminine. And sort of just, if you just release a word into the wild, people will use it or not use it, and they'll come up with their own word, because that's how languages worked before there were big buildings to decide it. So I think my take is, like, if you sit here and try, and, you know, if Damien decided that he was only going to speak kind of Calderas Romani to his family because that was an older version, that would be ridiculous. It's like sort of saying, oh, you know, I'll go back, and then you end up doing a sort of bad impression, like a sort of Renaissance fair character, rather than being an actual human being that has a language. Because my take, like at the start, is that language is a tool, and that the reason that words die out is because, you know, it's a tool that has become less effective, and it's good to have them preserved for different reasons. But I think that if we spend too long worrying about preservation, you kind of miss that there are people speaking it that are humans, and that's, you know, if none of us spoke any of the languages from our cultures, it wouldn't stop us being the people that we are. I wouldn't not be a traveller if I got, you know, the thing in Men in Black where he forgets everything. If they did that, and I forgot all of the words, I wouldn't go home and be disowned. You know, I'd still have the same thoughts and opinions. I just express them differently.
There's also something a bit ridiculous you've made me realise about the idea that a language, like, take Romani as an example, but really it goes for all the languages we're talking about and many others all around the world. Romani has survived a 1,000-year migration undertaken by largely very disadvantaged people, often impoverished. Survived slavery in large parts of Europe for 400 years. Survived the Holocaust, and a lack of institutional support all along the way. And yet we're worried about whether Boris Johnson recognises it as a language or not. I mean, there's something slightly ridiculous about that, isn't there? It's almost an insult, you know, to your own culture to see it like that.
Yeah, so that's a good thought, definitely. And I mean, it's interesting because one of the things that I've been involved with quite a lot recently is making education resources. And I've tried to put Kant in through those resources. And it's not because I want to teach, it's not because I want to teach non-travellers with Kant. It's not because I don't want to teach non-travellers with Kant. It's for a completely different purpose. It's to provide a degree of community ownership over that resource. Because I can remember when I went to school, there was nothing about traveller culture. Our histories were never mentioned. Our roles in history was never mentioned. It was nothing. There was absolutely nothing in textbooks about my people. And it was very difficult to then kind of sit there and think, well, what were my people doing at that point? You know, and I was lucky. I could go back to my family. I could be like, look, you know, what were we doing? You know, and I'd hear stories and I'd hear these types of things. But I think there's a degree of duty and responsibility on schools and education establishments to make sure the Bairns themselves actually feel part of that history. If we're teaching the history of our country, we should be there because we're part of that history. And so I put the cant in there so that traveller Bairns will look at that resource and they will recognise words. And for even that one split second sitting in that classroom, they're the ones who are not marginalised because they're the ones that understand the word. Right?
Well, that was why I made the animated film, because whenever I used to get meetings with the Department for Education about this, and we used to say, well, travellers don't feel included because there's no reference to them in the national curriculum. And they'd say, yeah, but we can't have lessons about every culture in the world. It's like, well, firstly, I'm not asking you that. I'm asking you to recognise cultures that have existed here for a very long time. Secondly, are you telling me you can't spare 5 minutes to show that film in the 11 years minimum that a child is attending school? That's ridiculous, and you know it is. I'm telling you now, if there'd been a reference to any of this, or a film like that, or, you know, a comic strip with some quality information in it that was supplied when I was at school, I'd have remembered that for the rest of my life. Instead, the memory I have is that the only formal reference to gypsies and travellers that was made when I was at primary school was a teacher who chose to read an anonymous poem about a thieving gypsy poacher for no apparent reason one day because she found it amusing. Is that really the best we've got to offer? I mean, nothing's better than that, but we can do better than nothing as well. Do you know what I mean?
No, but I think a part of that conversation is the equity of equality, the idea of minorities, especially here in Ireland, minority languages such as Irish are taught through the entire system. People spend around 13 years learning Irish.
Yeah.
You know, and so which really means it recognises that within law is that the heritage and history is very important. It was a part of the, along with the Senator Clegg, part of the construction and I suppose journey of the Traveller History and Culture and Education Bill. And what it wasn't about creating a module to teach people about travellers. It was to create a situation where Ireland's Indigenous people and ethnic minority people were reflected in the accurate history and events of what's been recorded. Like, travellers have always existed here. We're part of the uprising, we're part of the Civil War, part of the famine experiences, we're part of all this stuff. So to actually not to have us there takes effort. It actually us. And last year I took part in the NCCA, which is the National Curriculum Authority here in Ireland, and we reviewed the junior single cycles. There was not one example of traveller heritage or culture in the entire curriculum. So what the state does recognise in itself is that rather than just the idea of like, and I always thought this the floodgates theory was really bad. Like they were going, we start telling people about travellers, we have to start telling people about the Italians, and you're kind of going, where's the problem? What exactly is the problem? Like the idea of everybody should be able to find themselves within the curriculum. They find themselves supported and identified and cherished by an education system that's trying to promote us and unfortunately indoctrinate us a lot of the time. But the whole thing goes back to is it's kind of going, it takes effort to put it in there. It does do significant damage to people when they have their identity eroded. Because a lot of the education systems historically, especially in Ireland, was to teach out the traveller out of people, which makes them more settled. Which is incredibly problematic. But also what we're really asking for is that can we actually have a more accurate reflection of our history, of the geography, of the home economic skills, of the carpentry. The whole thing is we're not asking for anything unusual, we're just asking for something more truthful.
Yeah.
Just quickly, as we are sort of kind of rounding up a bit here, it is approaching 7:30. I will just quickly ask then, in the context of language, it's a very, very general question, I do apologise. In the context of language, going forward, what are your kind of hopes for it? What are your kind of, where do you see us in 10, 20, 30 years' time with regards to this conversation?
Keep having the same conversations. Worry in the same way that people have every generation has said, oh, I think this is going to be the last generation where we're able to travel, or I think this is going to be the last generation where we've been able to have fun fairs or whatever. I think that, my children will say, oh, I don't speak it like my dad did, in the same way that I say it about my dad, and we're all going to be just as jittery over nothing.
I'll go on, Rahela. Yeah.
What I'm hoping is to see definitely something more like in education wise, like more Roma teachers and like teaching the Romanesque language. Like it was always my dream to say that, to do something like that. But like, you know, there's nowhere you can actually learn the language. There's no courses. You can't learn it in school. So like, I'm always wondering, how is that ever going to happen if, you know, nobody is teaching it? Or are we ever going to have Roma teachers? And as well, like me growing up in Ireland, trying to like learn more about my history in school. Whenever there was like a teacher speaking about Roma people or, you know, travelers, she would read it out of a book, and then all like the Roma people or, you know, Roma students or travelers, we would all hide ourselves. We would actually, you know, put our heads into the books because everyone would look at us and say, oh, you're Roma or you're a traveler, and it wasn't seen as a good thing. So they were all kind of like just looking at us, and we just kind of felt like we shouldn't be there, because it wasn't nice things that were said about us, and it was very few things as well. So we kind of were like hiding our identity back then and not saying that we're Roma. And another thing is that like when people think about Roma, they don't think about like our culture or, you know, who we actually are. They kind of see us as what we're wearing as well. Like I know a lot of people were saying to me, you're not Roma because you're not wearing like, you know, those traditional clothes, those big, you know, colorful dresses, or, you know, like the dresses that they have to be down to the ground. And it's because we're just there's so many different types of Roma, and you know, we are Roma generations are getting more modern and modern. Like for example, like my grandmother, she still wears kind of long dresses, but they're not like colorful traditional dresses. They're just like long black dresses. Whereas like mother now, she's wearing more modern like skirts, and they don't have to be long. And whereas I was wearing, you know, jeans when I grew up. So, you know, we Roman people do tend to get more modern, and it's definitely like on each tradition as well. I know some people that are still wearing traditional clothes, and it's their choice, and they feel proud to do so, and it's how they grew up. And it really depends on the family as well, how you grow up as well. If your family is doing it, you will probably do it as well. But if you don't feel comfortable in, you know, wearing that as well, like if I would have done what my grandma did as well, you know, wearing those really long dresses, then I would do it as well. But it's not my choice. So I guess the kind of newer generation are being a bit more modern now, and the families are being more accepted as well. So they're definitely accepting more kind of Roma generation modernizing.
Are we going to answer some of these questions, or are we out of time?
I mean, I suppose it depends if people are willing to stick around, I guess, is the, I mean, are you talking about the question?
One that says, will this be a gap between monolingual Romanesque, bilingual Romani Gypsies who are also Anglophone? I think I can answer that pretty quickly. Very few Roma people are monolingual. Some are small children, and but almost always they'll learn the language of surrounding communities, often many languages as they get older. So there aren't really many people in the world who only speak the Romani language. And if they are, they're generally children.
Yeah, and I pick up the one around the potential resources of where it might be in 30 years. But I hope that obviously not just with education, but we actually have more resources. Like I see apps coming online. I see more of the songs being shared. I see like people taking part in the more creative endeavors, like the rising artists who are using their culture and expressions. And I think that rising presence won't end, because I mean our communities are far more connected than they've ever been. And the reasons to hold back something are far less than they've ever been in play. So I think that we may be still having part of this discussion, and the part of the discussion in 30 years around what we're doing with it, how do we protect it, how do we celebrate it. But I think that the rising generation will have answered that for us.
I mean, certainly from my perspective, whenever I'm asked, right, where travellers are going to be in 30 year or 10 year or 20 year or whatever, you know, because there's always, traveller culture's changed so much in the past 50 years in terms of our trade, in terms of how we live, and, you know, there's a lot that's changed. But there's a very, very famous expression amongst Scottish travellers. It was kind of coined by a woman called Belle Stewart. She was a tradition bearer. She was a ballad singer in our community. But the expression is, "Nakin will be a knee until the bean gadgy bings in the lichtman." Or in English, "Nakin will be here, travellers will be here until doomsday in the afternoon." So I think that really kind of culminates our whole spirit of strength and resilience, and the fact that, you know, yeah, we change, our culture changes, but we're flexible. We change with the times, but we'll always be here, and we're still travellers, Gypsy and Roma people at the end of the day. So that's really my take on that.
Fantastic. On which note, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed to Damien, Owen, Rahila, Tyler, and David as well. It's been wonderful. It's been really, really interesting to hear from all of you. And if anyone else has got any questions or comments, chuck them into that little, you know, thing down below. I'm sure we can get some of that scooped up.
I know we're going now, but I feel like I was a little bit hard on the police. I didn't mean that.
Go on.
I was just trying to be realistic about how people would feel, I think.
No, yeah. Like, I bristled at the idea immediately when someone said it, even though it might be a good idea overall. My first thought was, Geordie, no.
Well, I just thought, try that on and see how it fits, basically. Yeah.
Definitely.
Thanks, everyone, for having me. And
Not at all.
it's been a good chat, I think.
Yeah, thanks everyone for sharing the conversation. Very much appreciate it.
No, thank you all. And could I just say as well, in my other hat, as you know, a supporter of Progress and Dialogue, as founder of Progress and Dialogue, thank you everyone who attended. Thank you so much to all our amazing panelists. But could I also say that if you are interested in having more events like this, please do keep in touch. And we have a website as well, www.progressanddialogue.org.uk, and social media. So if you have any other questions after this event as well, we'd be happy to pass those on to the panelists. And if you would like to touch base with any of the panelists around specific projects or requests as well, we can pass your details on to the panelists as well. Grand. Okay, well, thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Yeah.
Right.
Bye, everyone.
Now, how does it work?